Hi, I'm Tom Woods, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I am your host, Doug Stewart, and I have an exciting book that I want to discuss with you. And no, it's not Faith Seeking Freedom, LCI's new book. It is a book that I have had on my coffee table since it arrived because it's just so beautiful, and I have one of the authors on to talk about it. Now, the book is called 10 Global Trends Every Smart Person Should Know, and Ronald Bailey is one of the co-authors with Marian Tupy. Ron is on with us to talk about the book. Now, Ron is an award-winning science correspondent for Reason Magazine and Reason.com. He's also the author of The End of Doom, Environmental Renewal in the 21st Century. Ron, thanks for coming on.
I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So I have to confess, and every book that I get that I have the author on, I read every word because I don't want to miss something. Your book is, I think, the first one that I didn't read every word. Now, I kind of have an excuse for that. It's this beautiful book that sits on my coffee table, and I don't want to read it all in one sitting. I want to just keep nibbling away at it because it is this full color with graphs and very digestible bite-sized things. I feel like I want to save the secrets of the middle of the book or near the end of the book and read it later because it's just so beautiful, and I want people to know that. But at the same time, I devour all the things that I read. I'm just oh, this is so good. This is so good. There's more of this, and I'm gonna save this for later. Your book is interesting timing in 2020. This book is about global trends everybody should know. And as a libertarian, you and I both know that the world is getting better. That's not the norm. And so I think this is the perfect
that is
year.
The norm.
No, I don't think people think, well, it is the norm. Sorry. I don't think that people think that that's the norm.
That's correct. Unfortunately, they are wrong.
And so this is the perfect year for your book to come out.
I wish it had been a better year instead, but yes, I hope it might cheer up some folks as
yeah, that's what I mean.
As the end of the pandemic is coming into sight. But yes.
Yeah. Well, that's what I kind of mean. It's we all need a glimmer of hope, and as it was published in the last month or so, this is a great time is to have a hopeful attitude toward the future here. So tell us about the book's features. It's not just a book that you pick up. I've kind of already mentioned that it's a kind of a beautiful coffee table book. Give us a little bit more.
Well, it's an idea that I've had for quite some time. I've written several books over the course of my life where I've looked at all kinds of global trends. You mentioned an earlier book, The End of Doom, for example. It was 300 or 400 page book, and it sold fairly well. But it's really hard to get people to spend that much time with the book anymore. So for a while, I thought, well, all right, I have all this data in my head. Is there a way for me to do this? And so that people can quickly get the information. They don't have to sit down and read through all of my chapters and so forth. And I thought, well, why not a picture book? And so this was conceived literally as a picture book where I would do charts and graphs and then have 250 words to 300 words explaining what the chart or the graph means. People, they can just pick it up. They don't have to read it from cover to cover. They can do as you're planning to do, just, bite-sized bits of things that interest them as they flip through the book. And so I had this idea, but I didn't have a particular way that I could figure out how to do it. So I approached Marian Tupy, who, as my co-author, he's the head of a fabulous website over at the Cato Institute called Human Progress. I took him out to lunch and I said, all right, I have this idea for a book. Will you help me? And he immediately said, yes. And so 2 years later, this is what we have.
Yeah, great. Well, his enthusiastic yes, I'm very happy with that you found a partner to accomplish this. Because when this came in the mail and I opened this up and I started reading, I'm like, yes, this is what we need. This is exactly it. One of my favorite things is that I actually, my wife, I will tell her these global trends or things that I see that are positive, and she'll be like, what, really? But what about this or what about that? So I'm reading through your book and I'm like, ooh, my wife needs to see this. So I snap a picture of it and I text it to her, right? It's all the words are right there. And there's the chart. This is how we're progressing here. So I could keep raving about that, but I think people want to hear more about the topics in the book. I mentioned that it's not the norm that people believe that the world is getting better. And you kind of address this in the introductory chapters of the book. Why are people not aware of this?
Well, there are a lot of different problems we discuss in that chapter, but the main thing I wanted to get across is that very smart people, and that's why we have that in the title of the book, 10 Global Trends Every Smart Person Should Know, is because smart people are out there consuming media, paying attention to studies, reading books and so forth about the problems of the world. And we're not saying there are no problems in the world. So they're very aware of what the problems are. What they're not aware of, we found, is they're not aware of how much progress has been made over time. Mm-hmm. And so what we wanted to do was to provide long-term trends so that smart people can understand exactly where we are in the world with regard to how we solve things and what remains to be solved. And so I guess the catchphrase I would use is you can't fix the world if you don't know where you are in it. You don't know how much progress has been made. And so one of the things that happens is that there's a negativity bias. I mean, this is something that's probably derived from our evolutionary history. One way that a zoologist explained it to me once is that when our ancestors were evolving on the plains of Africa, if a guy heard a rustle in a bush and he said, oh, it's just the wind, and it turned out to be a lion, he was selected out. He wasn't our ancestor. The guy who got scared and ran away, he's our ancestor. So we tend to think about things, worry about things as problems and discount things that have been already solved or are benefits to us. The other thing, of course, is that there's a negativity bias in the news. If it bleeds, it leads. And so everything we see in the news is typically bad news. And that is always in the forefront of our minds. And therefore, it obscures what's going on. And the final thing is that progress hides itself. Once the problem is solved, we just stop thinking about it. We move on to the next problem. So all the things that have been solved in the past are just, they're just in the background, and we're only looking to what remains to be solved. And therefore, again, we have a more negative bias.
Yeah. And you have this phrase in there that I actually highlighted, not physically, because I didn't want to highlight your book. I usually highlight all my books, but your book, I'm like, I can't highlight. I got to take notes elsewhere here. Steady progress is not news.
Correct.
Yeah.
Burning down a house is news. Building a house is not news.
Yeah. Yeah. That's crazy. It's one of those, a couple of years ago, I'll just share a quick story. We were asked in a small group with family, like if you were to share information to other people that you were really genuinely excited about, what would it be? And I wrote down instinctively, the world is getting better, not worse. And I now have like a gift I can give people and a tool in which I can show them and demonstrate to them without sending them, these thick books of, explaining, in 400 pages, one trend, right? So this is really great.
May I take a promotional moment? That you can't.
Yeah.
You can't have too many copies of 10 Global Trends. It makes a wonderful bar mitzvah gift, Christmas gift, birthday, anniversary, wedding, whatever. Yeah. You can't have too many copies.
Yeah, and it's also very affordable. I think coffee table books are usually kind of overpriced. This was, I think, within the $20 range here. At least on Amazon it was.
Right.
So it's very affordable. So you can afford to get one for you and for that person who just is a curmudgeon and thinks that the world is getting worse or just focuses on the negative. Ron, I'll help you promote your book any way I can. I bet you can clearly tell my excitement here. For those who might be a little bit concerned that I'm too excited about this book, I do have a few either critiques or questions about critics, which we'll get to. But as you were collaborating with this with Marian, did you already have the data sort of collected, or did you sort of collaborate on the concept after, that lunch meeting?
No, we did sit down and try to figure out what the longest term trends were that we could do globally. We wanted to find the data that would be totally uncontroversial. If there's any controversial data, we decided we wouldn't cover that trend. This data is based on, scientific reports, government reports, think tank reports. I mean, people call this optimism. It isn't. What we think of the book as is realistic. All we're doing is just the facts, ma'am, kind of data. And we list everything in there. And you can go look it up. We give you all the ways you can find out whether we're telling you the truth or not, or at least where the data is that we're basing the conclusions on. And so, again, I don't think of it as optimism. I think of it as a realistic, hard-edged view of the way the world actually is. So yes, we didn't know for sure. We did the research trying to figure out what the right trends would be to cover.
Yeah. Was there anything that surprised you as you were going through the research?
Well, a couple of things, probably. One of which was I was kind of surprised to discover that when you look at homicide rates around the world, not just deaths in war, by the way, we cover that. There are vastly fewer people dying in wars and so forth, but the actual murder rates around the world have been falling for most of the countries of the world for the last 5 decades or so. And it was a bit of a surprise for me on that one.
Yeah. In each of your chapters, sometimes it seems that you attribute the reason for the trend. Is that kind of consistent throughout, or do you try to leave it as sort of neutral and, just sort of presenting the trend rather than explaining it with a certain bias?
Well, let's put our priors up there. Both Marian and I are libertarians, so obviously we have a particular view about how free markets and the freedom of speech and democracy operate in order to create the trends. I mean, one of the things I want to go back to and remind everybody, and one of the things that we could be talking about one of these trends is the great enrichment, is prior to 2 centuries ago, the natural state of humanity was violent, ignorant poverty. Most people lived on less than $2 a day, considerably less than $2 a day in real dollars, and we document that. And something changed 2 centuries ago that allowed for increasing proportions of humanity to enjoy prosperity and greater peace and greater human flourishing over time. And those things I would identify as the creation, if you will, of essentially democratic liberal capitalism.
Were there any trends that you found that gave you a deep emotional response that sort of hit you personally?
Well, that's a good question. The one I always highlight, and it makes me happy to think about it, is, we talk about the great enrichment. One of the things that we point out is that the world economy grew 100-fold over the last 2 centuries, while world population grew 8-fold. Essentially, people have gotten vastly richer. Not everybody, obviously, and we're still hoping that more and more people will get to that stage, which brings me to my favorite trend, which is the end of poverty. And that's the second trend, because, you could imagine a world where a very few people get very rich indeed. The end of poverty basically shows that this process of enrichment also went to more and more people over time. Again, the data we show is that somewhere between 90-95% of everybody in 1820 on planet Earth lived on less than $2 a day in real dollars. And you can look at the data and figure out how that got calculated. And it took basically until 1980 or thereabouts for that to fall by half. That is, wow, that 45% of the people in the world were living on $2 a day. And that was a huge accomplishment. But since then, it's now below 10% people of living on $2 a day. It's been a vast acceleration in the creation of wealth and spreading to more and more people. The other flip side of it is, on planet Earth in 1900, just 120 years ago, average life expectancy on the planet was somewhere around 35 years. And it's more than doubled to over 72 years now. And that's for everybody. And again, that's the result of the end of poverty and the great enrichment. So all these trends interact together for basically creating a world in where more and more of our fellow human beings get to enjoy better and better lives.
Yeah. This idea that being informed about the trends, and it's interesting, like some people will talk about, the world is getting better, and that is a trend, but that word trend just has really stuck as I've been reading your book over the last week. I'm like, the word trend is really good because it doesn't say that we've arrived. It doesn't say that everything that could be calculated that sort of represents the trend is getting better. Like, things aren't getting better in all places at all times.
No, sadly.
Right? Right. I mean, eventually maybe that's where it'll be, but like that's not what the word trend communicates. So it's communicating something very accurate about the state of the world. It also means that you can't just look at today and say, hey, look at this problem today. There is, sexual exploitation. There is, human trafficking happening, right? And so there's the trend is sort of where we need to look at. And so I think that's a really important word. Obviously, it's part of the book because it helps us sort of give context in what we're actually communicating. When we say the world's getting better, we're not saying the world is perfect.
Right. I mean, if everything was getting better all the time, that, as Steven Pinker, I think, said, that would be a miracle. That wouldn't be progress.
Yeah, for sure. I had a conversation with somebody at a former employer. We were just kind of talking about things. We were talking about fossil fuels. And he asked me this question, and I want to use this as a way of getting into some of the specific trends. He asked me this question. We were talking about fossil fuels. He's all about, the renewables, or as Alex Epstein calls them, unreliables. And he's kind of like, so do you think the sun's going to stop burning before we run out of coal or fossil fuels? Like, which one do you think will happen first? And I was like, well, those aren't quite the same, sort of thing, because we have to acquire those things and use them. So we had a conversation about that. And he's a really intelligent person. So he wasn't just naively believing things. But one of the trends is about resource depletion, and that we're not running out of resources,
right,
including things like fossil fuels. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I want to give a complete shout out in that regard to my colleague, Marian Tupy, on that. He's been working on that. He has a new book that'll be out in the next year or so, going deeply into these particular trends. But basically what we find is that things are getting cheaper all the time. In this particular chapter, we're looking at 50 foundational commodities. They're basically, what do you think of food, minerals, metals, and fuels, right? And if you look at an index of all of those, they've gotten much cheaper over time. And he's going to be going back to the 19th century and looking forward. But what we do is look more recently. And what we find in real dollars is that they've gone down, 35% or so in real dollars since the 1980s as a basket of commodities. But then what Marian and his colleague, what's his name? Tooling? Anyway, what they've done is create what they call the Simon Index, where they look at how much time, your labor, does it take for you to acquire those particular commodities again. And if you look at actual human expenditure of time, what you find is those commodities are about 60% cheaper than they were 40 years ago. So things are getting much cheaper all the time. And so what we do know about things as they get cheaper, that is a signal that they're becoming more abundant, not more scarce.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's almost like you need to do a little bit of basic economics to understand this.
Right. It's kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, the other way to put it is that we get more out of less all the time. We look at another trend basically where you're looking at dematerialization over time, and this is happening across the board in all kinds of aspects of human existence, is that we just get more and more efficient, and we get more and more goods and services out of less and less stuff. And that's great, because one of the other trends that we document is that we're leaving more land for nature, for example, because we are using less land to grow more food all the time.
That was one of the forestation trend.
Yes.
That was one that actually shocked me. I had no idea. And I'm already attuned to these trends. Before the publishing of your book, I pay attention to this kind of thing, and I had no idea about the forest.
Yes, that does seem to surprise people, because you hear about places where there are problems. For example, there's still continued deforestation in basically South America at this point. Africa is not quite so bad. And again, that's a consequence of development and poverty and so forth. But we show the data, uncontroversial data again, done by researchers at the University of Maryland, where you find that over the last 40 years or so, for almost every other continent on planet Earth, the forests have been returning, essentially because people have been moving into cities and abandoning farmland.
So I know that as we begin to use resources in a more efficient way, the Christian way of putting this might be, we're better stewards of the limited resources we have. It's because we're making better use of it. So I think of things like using LEDs with respect to light, or with respect to energy, I should say, because energy used to cost a lot more for us to run, incandescents and other forms of, creating light. And now we're doing more of it because it costs less. For instance, my dad doesn't understand why I don't tell my kids to turn off the lights when they leave a room. It costs me 1/4 cent for the next day if they don't, or if they just leave the lights on, because I have LEDs in my house, right?
Right.
So with that sort of idea in mind, it's we use more of it. Does that mean that we are still emitting more carbons in the economy? Is our economy becoming worse and worse in that respect, or is that also getting better?
Well, it's an extremely good question. At the moment, humanity is probably going to continue to be burning fossil fuels and putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which will continue to increase the average temperature of the globe over time. We don't address climate change in the book explicitly. We acknowledge it in the beginning of it, but this is one of the trends that we figured everybody already knew. So that's not, we wanted to get to trends that people didn't know about, more or less. But I do think that climate change, if it goes unabated over the course of this century, it will likely become a significant problem for humanity. However, we do look at other trends. For example, we have one of the trend chapters is looking at the price of solar power, for example, which is going vastly down over time. Again, it is unreliable, but there are other technological fixes that are coming along. I'm fairly confident that human ingenuity is going to solve the energy problem in that regard. It is something that is a problem. We need to think about it, and we need to come up with good policies for doing that. But ultimately, my suspicion is, and this is that basically the world's economy will be mostly decarbonized by the middle of the century.
Well, that's optimistic. That's good.
I think yes. Again, you have to look at the energy savings, like the LEDs that you're talking about, combined with the capabilities of my preferred, if I were running the planet, which I'm not, and probably a good thing, it would be a combination of renewables with a baseload power out of sustainable nuclear power. And that would essentially, you basically electrify the economy and would no longer have to use fossil fuels.
Yeah. Your thought about it's a good thing you're not running the world. That's why I'm a libertarian, because I think I know what would make the world better, and that is evidence enough that I should not be in charge.
I think that's correct. Let's both agree to leave people alone.
I actually said that joke to somebody once, and they didn't quite get it.
Well, one of my favorite little T-shirts right now is, the Gadsden flag, "Don't tread on me."
Yeah.
My favorite one right now is "Don't tread on anybody."
Yeah. We've actually made stickers and stuff for that for our organization, and we have the word "me" crossed out and the word "anyone" put on there. It's really important, because the logical end to that is not a selfishness, but it's a respect for others.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk a little about free speech and free press. I think that is a lot of people are lamenting the state of affairs there. And again, you're talking about trends, so maybe this is just a blip. Maybe where does that stand?
Well, as we show, in that particular trend, it had been increasing over the last 5 decades or so, but it definitely slowed down the last decade and a half or so around the globe, and we acknowledge that. On the other hand, we are pointing out that it used to be a lot worse than it is now, with regard to countries that permit essentially free speech or moving in that direction. But no, it is something that, as a journalist, I'm incredibly worried about that all the time. One of the ways I like to think about the institutions that underpin human flourishing, it comes from a guy named Jonathan Rauch in his fabulous book, which you should buy just as soon as you purchased your 5 copies of 10 Global Trends. It's called Kindly Inquisitors. And he basically says that our, if you will, liberal free society lives on 3 pillars. And basically those pillars are what he calls capitalism, which is how we decide who gets what; democracy, which is how we decide who gets to wield coercive power; and then the critical one to me is called what he calls liberal science, which is how we find out what's true. And what he means by that is radical free speech, essentially, is it's every horrible socialist pamphlet up to the best peer-reviewed science. It's basically a gigantic societal debate of a free press where people get to hash out their ideas, and hopefully the better ones win. And if you have those 3 pillars, then you will basically have a rich and flourishing society.
So we live in a year where medical advancement is probably makes even the non-theist pray that we have rapid development of things like vaccines and medical improvements in this current year, because we want the world to get better in one particular way. And of course, we're talking about the coronavirus pandemic. What are the trends in medical research, health, and vaccine development?
They're I'm almost speechless in the face of what's happened over the last year. So I'm actually trying to work on an article.
It's my favorite graphic in your book that I've looked at through so far. I mean, I've kind of skimmed through all the graphics, but this one in particular is probably my favorite.
Right. It's basically we're showing where infectious diseases were first identified, and then how long it took for a good treatment, typically a vaccine, to come along. And, it's thousands of years for most of the diseases that have afflicted humanity over time. And medical progress is definitely speeding up over time. For example, people have had measles and smallpox and mumps and all kinds of diseases, influenza, and it took centuries and decades before an effective treatment or vaccine came along. What's happening with regard to the coronavirus that's afflicting us now is just absolutely astonishing, built on a huge amount of prior science. But essentially, the company Moderna, which is working on a vaccine that probably will be approved next week, not this week, but next week by the FDA, that's my prediction anyway, got the sequence of the virus and 7 days later had a vaccine. Now, they've had to go through and scale it up and develop it, but they had to basically develop a vaccine that they'll be selling us, hopefully, in less than 2 weeks, in a week. And they were using a new platform called messenger RNA that will make development of future vaccines extremely easy and cheap to do in the future. It's just an amazing advance. In my more optimistic moments, and I'm sure someone's going to come back and hold me to this, but I think that so much progress has been made in such a rapid way in responding to the pandemic that this literally may be the last pandemic humanity faces.
Well, that would be nice.
I think it will. I think I can be fairly confident of that. Yeah. But then again, there are so many other things that are coming along. We're learning so much more about the immune system and so forth. But then we have the other advancements of telemedicine, where you can deliver medical care to people over longer distances. And it just has basically the pandemic has speeded up a lot of progress in that regard because the emergency required us to do so. And I'm very happy with my species. It shows that we can be quite ingenious.
Yeah, I've been impressed in that way as well. And to be honest, I think that I would say that I like what you said. Like would you say I'm impressed with our species in that, like, we're proud of our species, that like we overcame something. And not only that, we found ways to be together while being separate in some, safe ways. So yeah, there's a lot to sort of be thankful for and, admire. The pessimist my inner pessimist is saying, I can see politics being the reason that you might be proven wrong.
Yes, there's as unfortunately some places on the globe, we'll call them Venezuela and Zimbabwe, and prove politicians can ruin the prospects of their populations pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But again, I want to go back to the trends. That is not I think that Venezuela and Zimbabwe are hearkening back to an old past, an evil past of humanity, the natural past of humanity, and that the trend toward greater freedom and flourishing will ultimately win out. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to keep people in Stone Age poverty when they can still get a smartphone and see how other people are living.
Yeah, well, that was going to be my kind of next question. Like, we see some of these trends, and on a chart, these lines go up sharply or they go down sharply. And for instance, I'm just going to do sort of like a visual, if I can, on a podcast here. If you see the trend going up pretty dramatically, or even if it's pretty steady, but it's really, really improved, what are the likelihood that there's going to be a plummet? Or are the institutions that we have strong enough to make the things that you and I today, and maybe even for a whole year, feel depressed about? Is it going to withstand? Is it going to prevent a plummet? Or what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, this is something that we kind of addressed briefly, at least, is that there's always people who do the what about. is that really smart people are going, well, that's all very well, Mr. Bailey, that you've pointed out all this wonderful progress has been made, but we can surely screw it up. And the answer is, yes, we can screw it up. But the evidence for us doing that in a permanent way is still also pretty slim. I mean, again, progress isn't a Panglossian march to the future with a straight line trend. There are going to be dips and jags and so forth. But I'm fairly confident if we can maintain societies with the institutions we discussed earlier, free markets, free press, and liberal democracy, then human flourishing can be pretty much guaranteed in the long run.
How do you know what data to choose when you're looking at I'm a sort of share my ignorance with how I'm talking and asking this question, but like, how do you know what data to go with? You can look at data on, for instance, income inequality or wealth inequality, and you on the one hand could say, hey, look, the gap is narrowing. And yet I would find somebody on the left would say, yeah, but if you look at this data set, these are the ones that we should look at, and it's getting worse.
Right.
And I'm sitting here as an armchair libertarian / just reader of data or how people present it. And I'm just like, I don't know who to believe.
Right. Well, on the income inequality data, we are citing a global trend. And one of the things I think we're pretty clear about is what we're showing is that if you're looking at countries over time, what you're finding is that the poorer countries are getting richer faster than the rich countries are getting richer. So they're converging over time. So that inequality between countries is declining. On the other hand, the folks on the left are correct, at least in countries like the United States and some other places. There has been an increase in income inequality in the population over time. And the question about that is, should we care about inequality or should we care about poverty? And I would prefer to care about lifting people out of poverty rather than making sure everybody is equally poor. But that's my particular bias. Yeah. But I understand why people might be concerned about inequality over time. But again, I want to go back. We're doing global trends. That's a good trend. But yes, it is a live question on what, if anything, we should do about rising income inequality in the United States. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the other things, if I might mention, that I'm also excited by is getting across to people how much safer the world is relative to natural disasters. Oh yeah, I mean one of the things that people are surprised. You hear about natural disasters all the time, yep. and with regard to climate change and so forth, there may be an upward trend in some of those natural disasters. But the fact of the matter is that compared to 100 years ago, your percentage chance of dying in a natural disaster is 1% of what it was in 1920. Basically, your chances of dying in a natural disaster have dropped by 99%. And again, that's because people are richer, they have better technologies, they have better warning systems, they have better housing, and all these things that can withstand the kinds of things that used to do people in.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we could put a GoPro on a hurricane once we know about it.
Exactly.
That's pretty crazy. I remember one time I heard about hurricane season, and I was like, it's like half the year. Like, I feel like a season should be like a few months rather than like half of our lives is hurricane season. It's just funny to me that, it's like that's when we pay attention.
We call it summer and fall.
Right? That's right. For sure. So I want to end with we've kind of touched on this, kind of throughout this conversation. There's two words or two ideas that you use about particular types of institutions. And it's honestly the way I see whether or not we can actually keep the progress, if you will, or keep the trend going in a positive direction. And that is the difference between extractive versus inclusive institutions.
Right.
I don't know if you want to give some thoughts on the differences between those, because those two words, I just am like, wow, those are perfect words to help summarize what can really aid in progress or impede it.
Right. These concepts come from a book called How Nations Fail by Robinson and Acemoglu. And it's a wonderful book. Another book that I particularly like is by Douglas North, And he was also looking at these things. And it's basically the idea is, let me go with it this way. Douglas North's book is called Violence and Social Orders. And it's very much in line as a theoretical basis for what Acemoglu's extractive institutions and inclusive institutions are. In North's telling of it, his thing is what is the biggest problem that faces humanity when they start getting in groups, when the agricultural revolution comes along? What's the biggest problem? And his answer is controlling violence. Because when you get, when you're in a small band of hunter-gatherers, 100 people or so, you can watch each other and kind of make sure you behave like a family group. But when you get a couple of thousand people, then it becomes easier for people to get away with trying to steal stuff or, attack you and that kind of thing. So what happens to control that is basically you create what he calls the natural state, which is essentially you create a king and you have some priests around them, and he promises to create a coalition that makes sure that the other guys can't steal your stuff or rape your wife. And so what you do over time is to create these institutions where the king is basically the guy it's a centralized authority where you have elites that create coalitions that promise to keep you safe over time. And this is all of human history. And I would argue, for example, some places like Venezuela or Zimbabwe or Russia or Saudi Arabia are still natural states. You still have people at the top who are extracting resources and then rewarding those resources to their followers over time. But what happened in the telling of Acemoglu, Robinson, and Douglas North is that 200 years ago, a set of institutions arose that were inclusive, that allowed all of a sudden for other people to participate in the economy over time. And North would identify that as basically getting control of the king by democratic means and recognizing private property that could be sold, because you had to get out of the system where property was basically inherited in family lines forever and ever and ever. And you created commercial markets over time. And when you have those things together, you create institutions where everyone can slowly but surely begin to participate. Because basically, the rule of law now applies to everybody. And once you created that, you found what we call the Great Enrichment came about, is that all of a sudden the natural state of human poverty begins to abate over time. And to the extent we can maintain those institutions, those inclusive institutions, again, democracy, free speech, free markets, I think we can guarantee further human flourishing.
Well, I certainly agree, and I hope that we can keep it as well. Ron, I appreciate you coming on and talking about this book. I hope people buy it and give it away. And
Me too.
Yeah, you too.
I'm a capitalist. Why not?
Yeah, right. One thing that has occurred to me in this conversation is like, we're gonna have done this conversation, and it's no longer gonna sit just on my, desk where I work, but I'm gonna put it on our family coffee table and my young kids. And I'm like, you should have a kids version. You can call it "Things Are Getting Better" or 80 Reasons Why Things Are Getting Better in the World or something like that. And then it's illustrated by children or something. But yeah, 10 global trends every smart person should know, and many others you will find interesting is the title of the book. You can go buy it. And Ron, thanks again for being on.
Thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, same here.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group you are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to find out more about LCI, visit us on the web at libertarianchristians.com. The voiceovers are by Matt Bellis and Catherine Williams. As of episode 115, our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.